Today we're going to talk about the parts of a plant. We're going to talk about the root, the stem, and most importantly we're going to focus on the flower of a plant. And we're going to focus on how the flower actually gets pollinated and fertilized, because it turns out the flowers of plants are mainly what's responsible for the reproduction in plants. So we're going to talk about all the parts, but we're going to focus mainly on the flower of a plant and how it relates to reproduction. So what are the main parts of plant? Well, they're the root, the stem, and the flower. The roots. What's the purpose of the root? Well, the root is meant to absorb water and minerals from the soil. So basically the root's sole purpose is to pretty much, well, it's not its sole purpose. It also helps to hold the plant in the ground, but its main purpose is basically to absorb water and minerals from the soil. And the cells inside of a root are designed specifically for that purpose. The cells inside of a root, we call them root hair cells. Okay? And they basically look like this if you were able to see them. They are microscopic, but if you were able to blow them up so that you could actually see them, they would look like this. Root hair cells have a very long projection here that allows them to basically wiggle their way through the dirt and through the cracks in the soil. And this long projection part here is designed to absorb water and minerals. And then they have attached to this long projection a very large vacuole. That vacuole is designed to hold lots of water and minerals until it can travel up the stem. So basically this is a root hair cell. It's got a long projection which wiggles through the dirt and gets into the cracks and the crevices in the dirt to gather water, and then a large vacuole to store the water. How does the stem work? Well, the purpose of the stem is to transport water and glucose throughout the plant. The stem contains two fibrous-like tubes. One of them is called the xylem, and the other one is called the phloem. The xylem is meant to carry water up and down the plant, so water travels from the roots up the xylem inside the stem to get to the leaves and the fruit of the plant. And the phloem is meant to carry sugars throughout the plant. So the sugars, when they're made inside of the leaves, come through the leaves into the stem, and they go in the phloem, and they travel up and down the plant through the phloem. So the xylem is for water, and the phloem is for carrying glucose or sugars. Now the flower, what's the purpose of the flower on a plant? Well, the purpose of it is all about reproduction. Okay? Flowers are designed to help the plant reproduce. Okay? And there are many parts to a flower we're going to talk about today, but you can put them into three basic categories. You have the protective and attractive parts of the flower. These are the parts of the flower that protect it and attract basically insects to the flower. Then you have the male parts of the flower. They're called the stamen. And you have the female parts of the flower. They're called the carpels. Let's start with the protective and attractive parts. Here you have the petals. The petals basically are beautifully colored. They attract insects through their color. Okay? They also smell really good, which attracts insects. And they're also meant to protect basically the ovary and the male and female parts of the flower. So that's the petal. They attract insects and protect the flower. Down here, these little leaves at the bottom of the flower are called the sepals. Those are meant to protect the flower before it actually opens up. So when the flower is a little bud, these sepals actually protect the bud before the bud opens up. It doesn't show on here, but down here also you'll have things called nectaries. Nectaries make nectar, which contain like sugary substances which attract bees and insects to them. In fact, bees use the nectar in order to make honey, so the flowers attract the bees through the nectaries and the nectar. Now, in reproduction, in sexual reproduction, which is reproduction between two partners, you usually have you always have a male part and a female part, and flowers are no different. The male parts of the flower are called the stamen, and it consists of this long tube called the filament, which connects the anther to the stalk, okay, and the anther. The anther, guys, basically creates pollen. Pollen is the male part in reproduction that is used for reproduction. So you have the anther, which makes pollen, and the filament, which connects the anther to the rest of the plant. Those are the male parts. The female parts of the plant are called the carpels. You have this finger projection looking, hand looking type thing up here. It's called the stigma. And the stigma catches pollen. Okay, so its whole purpose is to catch pollen. Then you have this long tube that connects the stigma to the ovary. That's called the style. And finally down here you have the ovary, which contains the eggs, which are also known as ovules. Okay? And that's the female part of the plant. Now, reproduction in plants consists of two different processes. The first process is called pollination. Pollination is basically getting the pollen from the anther to the stigma so that it can then go down and meet up with the ovules and fuse together to make seeds. So pollination is all about getting the pollen from the anther to the stigma. There are two types of pollination. There's self-pollination and cross-pollination. Self-pollination is when one flower, the pollen from its anther, goes directly to its own stigma. So the pollen from the anther goes to the stigma on the exact same flower. And that's called self-pollination. Cross-pollination is when the pollen from an anther actually travels to a different flower and goes to the stigma on a different flower. And that's called cross-pollination. Now I'll let you know, guys, most flowers in the world actually reproduce through cross-pollination, but there are some that do self-pollinate. So that's pollination. Basically, pollination is getting the pollen from the anther to the stigma. If it's on the exact same flower, we call it self-pollination. If it's on a completely different flower, we call it cross-pollination. So how does pollen travel from the anther of one flower to the stigma of a completely different flower? Well, there's several ways. Insects can land on the flower, rub up against the anther, get the pollen on them, and then they can fly miles and miles to a different flower, land on the different flower, and get the pollen from the old flower, from the other flower onto the stigma of the new flower. So insects can transfer pollen. The wind can pick up the pollen from the anther and carry it again, sometimes miles, to the stigma of a different flower. Sometimes pollen can fall into the water, and the pollen will travel through the water to the stigma of a different flower. Sometimes pollen gets stuck on animal fur and travels, and then there's all kinds of other weird and interesting ways you'll read about in your textbook. But basically, these are the main ways that pollen can go from an anther on one flower to the stigma on a completely different flower. The second part of the process is called fertilization. Okay? So once pollination has happened, once the pollen from the anther has gotten onto the stigma of usually a different flower, then the process of fertilization happens. Fertilization is the process of pollen going into the ovary here and fusing with an egg and making seeds. Okay? So how does this process work? Well, once the pollen lands on the stigma, the pollen's actually inside of something called a little pollen grain. And this pollen grain basically starts growing a pollen tube. And that pollen tube grows down through the style into the ovary. You can think of it like a giant slide. Basically, it's growing its own giant slide down the style into the ovary. Then the pollen will slide down that pollen tube and go into the ovary, and it will basically meet up with an ovule or an egg inside. And the two will fuse together. Their DNA will fuse together, and they create something called a zygote. A zygote is basically where the male pollen and the female egg parts of the plant or the flower fuse together. This zygote then develops over time and turns into seeds. Okay? So these seeds are now located inside the ovary. Once you have seeds inside the ovary, one of two things happens. Either this ovary turns into a piece of fruit, and the seeds are then inside the fruit, or the petals fall away, the anthers fall away, the ovary opens up, and those seeds then travel through the wind to new places. So basically, fertilization is the pollen grain grows a pollen tube down the style into the ovary. The pollen slides down the tube, lands on an egg or an ovule, fuses with that egg, and seeds grow. And then you either get this ovary turning into fruit, or you get it opening up so that the seeds can travel through the wind. So why do seeds have to travel to new places? Well, first of all, seeds traveling to new places is called seed dispersal. You're going to want to put that one in your glossary, guys. Seed dispersal is when seeds travel to new places. And there's a couple of reasons why this has to happen. First of all, to avoid competition. If you think about it, If all the seeds from a flower or a plant basically just fell down right next to that exact same plant, all those seeds would try to grow new plants in that one spot, and they would all be competing for water, they'd be competing for minerals, they'd be competing for resources, and so there'd be a lot of competition. So seeds need to travel to new places so that there's less competition. Okay. Another reason why seeds need to disperse or travel to new places is so that the species can spread out. Again, if you think about it, if a plant species only lives in one little area and anything happens to that area, that plant species will go extinct. Okay? So seed dispersal happens to try to keep the species of the plants alive. Nature makes seed dispersal happen so that the species of plants can live and survive in many different places. And that way, if one place gets wiped out for some reason, the species doesn't go extinct. So how do the seeds travel? Well, animals sometimes eat the fruit that's created from that ovary that has the seeds inside, and then they'll travel miles and miles and miles, and then they'll defecate. Defecate is a fancy word for poop. The seeds are designed so that they don't dissolve inside the digestive system of the animal. They actually end up coming out with the feces or the poop and in the new place. And then they can create plants there. If you think about it, it's kind of cool because they have their own little fertilizer there to grow with. So basically, they've got everything they need in the new place to grow. Sometimes animals get seeds in their fur, for instance, thorns or burrs. If they get a burr or a thorn, they can travel miles and miles and miles, and finally that thorn or burr will fall out in a new place. The wind carries seeds through the air. For instance, if you've ever seen a dandelion, that's one of those little fluffy looking plants that looks like a giant cotton ball. Okay, and when you blow on the cotton ball, basically the fibers from the cotton ball blow into the wind and go everywhere. Okay, basically those are seeds in the little cotton ball looking thing. It has seeds, and when you blow on it, and the seeds end up traveling through the wind to new places and make new plants or plant new plants. And finally, seeds can drop into the water and travel through the water. And the coolest example of this that I can think of is a coconut tree. A coconut tree is on the beach and it makes its seeds. Its seeds are basically the coconuts. When the coconuts fall into the water, or they fall onto the beach, first of all, the ocean comes up and carries them out into the ocean, and then they can travel miles and miles and miles and be deposited on a new beach, covered up with sand, and grow a new coconut tree. And those those coconuts are actually designed so that the salt water and falling to the ground and all of that doesn't hurt them. That's why coconuts are so hard to open if you've ever tried to open one, because they're designed to go through a whole lot so that they can travel through the water and make new coconut trees on new beaches.